X-Men 97 Season 2 is taking us back to the 90s, when Emma Frost was captivating on trading cards and Onslaught was making his way onto the spinner rack, a time when comics were dark, gritty, and radical. But before the 90s explosion of comic book cartoons that brought us the X-Men we know and love, there was something else. Something only talked about nowadays in whispers and thought to be a joke by those who don't know about it. Before Wolverine and the X-Men, before X-Men Evolution, before even X-Men the Animated Series, there was no place to hide. There was no place to run. There was the Pryde of the X-Men.
No place to hide. No place to run. No place to run. The mutant age has now begun.
From 1988 to 1991, on Fox, NBC, or ABC, depending on where you live, you could find the Marvel Action Universe television block. If you were a kid catching this block of television, you could lose yourself in Dino Riders and RoboCop, along with reruns of older shows like Spider-Woman, The New Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, just to name a few. Production on Dino Riders and RoboCop was spearheaded by Marvel Productions, who by then had helped to produce series based on their in-house characters, as well as every major show based around a Hasbro product. We're talking toy lines like Transformers, Gem, My Little Pony, and G.I. Joe. In fact, aside from their own heroes, Marvel Productions mainly produced glorified commercials for kids' toys and games. Hell, they even produced Potato Head Kids.
Go potatoes, everyone! Potato Head Kids! Having so much fun!
The amount of non-Marvel properties that Marvel Productions produced was frankly astonishing. By the time Marvel Action Universe hit the airwaves in 1988, Marvel Productions had only produced 9 shows based on their own properties. That's including the time before there even was a Marvel Productions, when it was Marvel Comics co-producing along with animation companies. Counting only the Productions era, there were 3 shows based on the comics prior to the Action Universe block. Compare that to the 21 non-Marvel based properties the company produced. Granted, Marvel Comics was creating the books to go along with said properties, but the point stands. Marvel Productions couldn't get a long-running comic book cartoon off the ground. Investors for the show simply weren't there, and only one of the 3 shows they managed to produce ran longer than a year. That, of course, being Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends would be fondly remembered, more so than its counterpart Spider-Man show, as it frequently featured characters from throughout the Marvel Universe. Characters like Shaun of the She-Devil, Captain America, Namor, and yes, even the X-Men. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends would be the second and third on-screen appearance of the X-Men, the first being a solid 15 years earlier on the Marvel Superheroes TV show in 1966, during a segment called Dr. Doom's Day. But even then, they were named as the Allies of Peace, not the X-Men. Until the giant-sized Claremont era, they simply were not seen as a team that were worth adapting, as awful as that may sound. But from Marvel's earliest TV productions in the mid-60s to the establishment of Marvel Productions in 1980, the X-Men comic had been cancelled, revived as reprints, and then wholly revived through the creative talents of Chris Claremont, Dave Cockrum, and John Byrne. By 1981, when Marvel Productions' name hit the airwaves with the Spider-Man cartoon, X-Men, now under the Uncanny moniker, had become a powerhouse book. It was one of, if not, the hottest-selling book on newsstands and in shops, especially post-Dark Phoenix Saga, which wrapped up less than a year prior to Marvel Productions' establishment. Yet, that still wasn't enough to warrant a cartoon based off the team of mutant heroes. From 2 scattered appearances in pre-established cartoons 15 years apart, and with Marvel Productions halting the creation of shows based on their characters after Amazing Spider-Man and His Friends ended in 1983, it looked as though the X-Men would never receive a solo outing on television. Or so it would seem until 1989. In 1988, Marvel Action Universe arrived on television screens, a 90-minute block containing Dino Riders, RoboCop, and reruns of previous Marvel animated projects. As I stated before, Marvel essentially halted productions on cartoons based on their own licenses in 1983. Marvel Action Universe's only semblance of being a Marvel product was its reruns of Spider-Man from 1981, which would alternate with episodes of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which ran from 81 to 83. Marvel would produce a miniseries comic based on Dino Riders and an ongoing of RoboCop, but those wouldn't hit shelves until 1989 and 1990 respectively. At best, Marvel Action Universe was promoting the toy lines based around the 2 properties, continuing Marvel Productions' main output of cartoon commercials only made possible by television deregulation in the early 80s, but that's a whole other topic for another time and another type of video. In 1987, prior to the block's launch, Marvel Productions president Margaret Loesch, who is quoted as having said, "For years we couldn't give a Marvel property away," decided to take matters into her own hands. Taking aside $300,000 from RoboCop's budget, she ordered a TV animation pilot for the mutant superhero team. Thus, in 1989, Pryde of the X-Men was released to the world. A bona fide solo X-Men pilot. So what was this pilot like? How did it fare? Pryde of the X-Men was written by Larry Parr, who had previously written episodes of Plastic Man, Spider-Man, Transformers, Defenders of the Earth, and a multitude of other animated projects. The pilot was produced by Rick Hoberg, Larry Houston, and Will Manoy. Then there was character designer Russ Heath, who created the cast lineup. He was known for his various war comics at DC and horror stories at Marvel. Carol Lundberg, a staple of 80s cartoon character design and modeling, also lended a hand in creating the animated cast of Pryde of the X-Men. With all these names attached, the creative team for the pilot was solid as a rock. Animation would be left to Toei Animation in Japan, a household name that I'm certain everybody who's anybody knows. We're talking Dragon Ball and One Piece. But if anime isn't your thing, they worked on Transformers and G.I. Joe Real American Hero. Music was done by Robert J. Walsh, who did musical work on tons of 80s cartoons. Pryde of the X-Men had everything it needed to succeed. A writer with experience, producers who knew comics, and an animation studio that had helped produce some of the most iconic cartoons of the 80s. So, it's a no-brainer that this pilot spawned a whole show, right? Right? Let's get into the meat of this pilot. Pryde of the X-Men immediately sets up a tradition for X-Men cartoons, which is having an opening that absolutely rips.
X-Men, X-Men, it's the day, X-Men, X-Men, coming your way. Magneto's hordes are on the way to pillage, burn, and plunder.
The pilot is set up into 3 acts. They're not given names of any kind, but they begin with narration by Stan Lee. The opening narration immediately throws the argument of, you never know who may be a mutant, right at the audience, and tells us there are good mutants and terrorist mutants. It's solid and gives us a quick explanation of the world we're being thrust into. Magneto, our main terrorist mutant, is being hauled to prison as far as we know. The humans transporting him openly express their hatred for mutants, and Magneto even tells them that his brotherhood of mutant terrorists will wipe humanity off the face of the earth. The addition of terrorists to the Brotherhood name is interesting. They could have chosen to go with the original Brotherhood of Evil Mutants name, but decided to make them outright terrorists instead. Terrorist is an interesting term to use, as people in power tend to dictate what is and is not a terrorist, because a terrorist tends to be someone or a group of people who are usually not the power in charge. It sets them up as the outsiders. It arguably doesn't even set them up as inherently evil in nature. But considering this is a late 80s kids cartoon pilot, the word terrorist was most definitely used to mean they're evil. I wanted to point out the change though, as X-Men from its inception was political in nature, and using a politically charged term like terrorist to refer to the villains feels not insignificant. Anyways, Emma Frost saves Magneto, which is a significant change to her character considering she's never been a part of Magneto's Brotherhood. And at the time of this pilot being released, the two characters really hadn't interacted a ton. And even then, their interactions more so revolved around the New Mutants. Emma's place in the whole pilot is honestly odd, especially when they give her telekinetic powers to free Magneto, which she has never had. At this point in time, she didn't even have her second mutation diamond form yet. When all is said and done, though, I can understand Emma being in the pilot. She, at this moment in time, was rising in popularity as a character and makes sense as the de facto girl villain when introducing the X-Men through a singular episode like this. And she is directly tied to characters in this pilot. Still, her placement within the pilot and her powers are still very different from her comic counterpart. I'd argue Mystique would have worked just as fine as the girl villain, especially since she's actually been a part of the Brotherhood. But like I said, Emma's direct ties to characters in the pilot probably played a factor in her inclusion, though she is far from the only character who has had changes made to them. Once Magneto is freed, we're introduced to Kitty Pryde, our audience surrogate, who has been summoned to the X-Mansion by Professor Xavier. A very different origin for Kitty, as her introduction in the comics was a major part of the Dark Phoenix saga, where she was approached by Emma Frost and Professor Xavier about joining their respective organizations, but was ultimately kidnapped by Frost and then saved by the X-Men, joining their ranks soon after. During this time is when she first develops her powers, while in the pilot, Professor Xavier already knows what they are and where to find her. We proceed to get a lovely explanation about Cerebro and how Kitty herself is a mutant, something she's terrified of. But no time to dwell on that, it's time for character introductions. Thankfully, we have Professor X to give us a breakdown. In the Danger Room, we find the X-Men utilizing their powers. Cyclops takes down a wooden contraption with his optic blasts. Colossus transforms into his metallic form to break through walls. Dazzler uses blasts of concentrated light to destroy giant plants. Nightcrawler teleports around a robot that Wolverine destroys. Storm just kind of messes with the weather a little. They don't really show her powers being uber powerful in this. The makeup of the team is worth discussing. The entire team is most of the giant-sized roster, save Banshee and Jean. Dazzler is on this team, who, when this pilot would have started production, would have been on the team maybe a year. The team at the time in the books during production also would have featured characters like Psylocke, Rogue, and Longshot. But it makes sense to go with a heavily weighted giant-sized roster, as they would be the most popular and established characters at this point, which makes Dazzler's inclusion instead of, say, Jean all the more interesting. Especially since by the time this pilot came around, Jean had been back in the comics for quite a few years. If I had to make an educated guess as to why Dazzler was specifically chosen from the Outback era team to be a part of Pryde of the X-Men, it's probably because at that point in time, she was the only X-Men character to have her own solo ongoing book. She would be a character people would instantly recognize as being part of the X-Men universe. 42 issues, crossovers with Spider-Man, and a dedicated graphic novel all out years before Pryde of the X-Men. Pound for pound, Dazzler was the biggest X-Men character who wasn't frequently a part of an X-Men team book. And I'm not only saying all this because she's one of my favorite X-Men, it just makes sense looking at the dates and numbers. Quick addendum here in the video. I did actually find out why Dazzler was included, or at least more in depth than I had initially pitched it as, and it's because New World, who owned Marvel at the time, was still convinced that they were going to get a record for Dazzler. Her original creation, that was the intent, was to have a character that would sell records, have a movie, so on and so forth. That clearly never happened, and Marvel never achieved such a thing despite trying multiple times, but that was Dazzler's original intent, and her intent for being here. Moving past my Dazzler tangent, when Kitty meets the X-Men, she is immediately terrified of Nightcrawler and phases into the danger room, our first time seeing her powers in action. Immediately, the team begins to argue about Kitty joining the X-Men, where we find out that Wolverine is Australian?
She's not joining the X-Men, is she? She's just a kid.
Nor is it the first time. When the X-Men appeared in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends episode of Firestar is Born, he is notably Australian there as well.
How you doing? Want a piece of fruit?
The only somewhat definitive info I can find is about Pryde, and is from a book called X-Men: The Characters in Their Universe, where Rick Hoberg revealed that he was made to make the character Australian due to the fact that Wolverine was going to be revealed to be Australian, which makes no sense as he had already been set up as Canadian for years by the time the Outback era began. The choice in Pryde is also said to be influenced by the growing popularity of Australian-made films in America, such as Crocodile Dundee and the Mad Max films. But again, this doesn't account for the fact that he was Australian in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Crocodile Dundee came out 3 years after Amazing Friends concluded, and Mad Max was out for a couple years before the episode aired, but it didn't make waves in America to the point where Mad Max 2 was released as The Road Warrior in the States a year before A Firestar is Born. Wilma Noyes quoted as saying that New World Pictures was working to develop a Wolverine film after the success of Crocodile Dundee, which makes no sense for any of this and really adds nothing beyond the fact that I guess that was a thing that was going to happen. Either way, we have an idea as to why Wolverine was Australian in Pryde, but not Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Sadly, the voice director for Amazing Friends passed away a bit of time ago, and the voice actor William Calloway is 84, and I'm not going to try and contact and pester an old retired actor about a role he played over 40 years ago one time. I'm crazy when it comes to research, but not insane. This leaves me at the point where I have to consider there may actually be merit to the notion that they were going to reveal Wolverine was Australian that whole time in the comics, but that would be insane to do. It wouldn't even change anything significant about the character in a way that would make sense to make that change. Why would Len Wein and Chris Claremont establish him as Canadian only for him to be made Australian? There's not even a single thing in the comics to insinuate he was Australian ever. He's framed as Canadian from the beginning. I'm genuinely losing it over the fact that none of this makes sense. Every appearance of Wolverine's Australian voice and its supposed origin contradict each other. The Australian capturing of the American minds in the 80s can explain Pryde, but it can't explain Amazing Friends. And the idea that Wolverine was going to be made Australian doesn't make sense for either. What the actual fuck? Okay, back in the show. We're calm, we're collected, and the X-Men are off to battle. We're going to speedrun our way through the rest of this pilot. I'm just going to rattle off the rest of my plot notes. The rest will be here for the next month. Act 2, the X-Men go to leave in the Blackbird. Magneto's terrorists are at a deep space observatory, but not before Scott asks the professor if Magneto's plan is to get him alone. But, of course, that won't happen. So, of course, Magneto and Juggernaut attack the mansion. Professor X explains how Magneto and Co. are terrorists and plan to enslave the world. They get into the mansion because Kitty accidentally phases into the defense system, scrambling it. Professor X reads Magneto's mind, finding out he wants Cerebro's mutant power circuits, and Professor X entrusts it to Kitty. Magneto chases her, and Kitty refuses to give it up, but he eventually does scare her, and she hands it over. The X-Men confront Blob and Pyro at the Deep Space Observatory. They're looking for info on a Scorpio comet, and they escape. Back at Magneto's base, they track the comet and do something with Cerebro. It's unclear. Lockheed is at their base for some reason. I don't know what that's about. X-Men adaptations and putting Lockheed in oddest of the places. I don't know what it is. Here it was a Magneto's base, New Mutants movie, he was a puppet, but also real and Magic's partner. It's odd. Anyways, the X-Men return to the mansion, and Kitty keeps getting scared of Nightcrawler, and Wolverine continues to be Australian.
Get with it! The X-Men don't have room for whiny brats!
Professor X uses his brain to see that Magneto is on Asteroid M and has captured the Scorpio comet. He's going to throw it at Earth and kill all humans. That's his plan. As if that won't also kill all other mutants. Act 3 once again has more Stanley narration, much like Act 2 and Act 1 did. The X-Men go to fight Magneto and leave Kitty behind. And the X-Men fly up to Asteroid M, and Kitty snuck on board, of course. They infiltrate the asteroid and end up fighting one-on-ones. Dazzler vs. Pyro, Wolverine vs. Toad, Colossus vs. Juggernaut, Cyclops vs. Emma, and Nightcrawler vs. Blob, who just, disappears mid-fight. Kitty and Lockheed attack Magneto, causing him to shoot magnetism beams and disconnect the Cerebro circuit. But they force Magneto to change the course of the comet. But Nightcrawler has to hold the circuit closed, or the comet will head back to Earth instead of Asteroid M. Magneto and crew just kind of fuck off, and Nightcrawler offers to stay behind. Though, he teleports out and almost burns up in the atmosphere. They think he's dead, but he manages to teleport back onto the Blackbird in the nick of time. Kitty is no longer mean to Nightcrawler now that he's, basically almost sacrificed his life for her. Wolverine is cool with Kitty now, kinda. She's not an X-Men yet. It sets up more episodes. And, of course, Stan Lee gives us a closing outro. And that's the quick rundown of Pryde of the X-Men. While my synopsis and temporary mental breakdown provides an overview, you should hunt down a copy of the episode yourself if you can. I think it's a cool piece to have in your collection, and you should watch it for the sake of understanding where we are now. So I guess the question to be asked is, how does it fare as an adaptation, and what is its legacy? Much like most X-Men adaptations, I wouldn't call it a good one. I think it's beautifully animated with a fantastic cast, but the writing is what it is, which is a pilot made using money stolen from the budget of another show. It's also an introductory episode. There isn't much to be expected. We spent the whole third of the runtime just learning who the characters are. There's a reason so many cartoons with ensemble casts do multi-parter opening stories. So the first storyline isn't bloated with introductions. Heck, X-Men the Animated Series did it with Night of the Sentinels, its opening story. It was a two-part story which allowed for a solid tale and introductions. A lot of people remember Pryde of the X-Men as the pilot of X-Men the Animated Series for some reason, even though the two are hardly connected. There's very little shared between them aside from staff. The team makeup isn't that similar if we really look at it. There's also a solid 3 years between the two. Outside of television though, Pryde of the X-Men certainly had an impact. If you were a kid of the 90s, or have a love for the retro like I do, you might remember a little game called X-Men by Konami, an up to 6-player side-scrolling beat-em-up that utilized 2 different screens and an arcade cabinet. One of the highest-grossing arcade games of 1992, any kid who stepped foot in a mall or arcade in the 90s knew about this game. While its release coincided with the releases of X-Men the Animated Series, its gameplay and lineup were influenced more by Pryde of the X-Men. Even the villains are influenced by Pryde. While some are clearly pulled from the comics, most of the villains are Pryde's featured baddies. The game also ends on Asteroid M, much like Pryde does. I mean, Magneto kidnaps Kitty and Professor X in the game. That's not exactly what happens in Pryde, but Kitty isn't present in the animated series whatsoever. The X-Men arcade game is a Pryde of the X-Men game through and through. There's one other piece of media outside the pilot that we need to discuss before we finish, and it's a weird one. It's the CD album, music from and inspired by the original TV movie Pryde of the X-Men. Odd is really the only way I know how to describe this. Pryde aired in 1989, while the copyright on the CD says 2000. Yes, I did buy the CD for this video, and yes, I did listen to it front to back. It opens and is filled with various sections where it's Stanley either narrating or answering interview questions. There's not much to discuss with that, as it's a lot of the same answers you'll hear from Stan about the X-Men in any interview. The opening narration by him is fun, though. Outside of the supposed soundtrack elements, which I'll discuss in a moment, this album features tracks by Ghetto Inmates and Mobb Deep and their various members. I was frankly baffled to see them on here. Either way, it needs to be said that most of the rap and hip-hop tracks on here warrant the parental advisory warning on the album. Yes, the parental advisory warning. On an album from 2000, supposedly based on a cartoon pilot from 1989. What? This whole album is odd, like I said. The soundtrack elements I mentioned earlier aren't even from the pilot. They're remade tracks by the Encino Light Orchestra. And then we have the rock tracks by the Robert Walsh Project that sound like, I don't know, Rob Zombie ripoffs about being extreme? This whole album confuses me, and I'm not sure it was worth the $15 I paid on eBay. I actually dropped a few bucks on this video. That book I mentioned earlier, where I pulled the quote about Australian Wolverine from, bought that on eBay too. I needed a direct source, not just articles for something that, in my opinion, is very important to the discussion of Pryde of the X-Men. I want to wrap this up by saying I think it's interesting to look back at the history of X-Men's struggles to break out as its own property. There's the saying that there's Marvel fans, and then there's X-Men fans, and it's certainly true. Many people don't read the greater Marvel Universe, but read everything X-Men. So the fact that it took so long for them to finally land an ongoing show with as much cultural relevance as it has is a little surprising, but also not at the same time. Aside from the comics, there were real no X-Men toy lines until the 90s, and the best way to sell a show back in the day was to have some toys and trading cards with it, not a CD soundtrack made 10 years later. X-Men, the animated series, might have cemented the X-Men as a cultural touchstone, but it stands on the shoulders of a lone pilot long forgotten by many.